Good morning, everyone. You're in for a treat. You guys got yourself a 5-minute homily this morning. The only thing that would make it better if there was no homily at all, but I got a good story for y'all today. I'm setting a timer on my watch here. When I was in college, I was reading the works of John Wesley, who was the founding minister of the Methodist movement, which I was ordained in, raised in. And when he was a young man, he wrote boldly in his journal a phrase in Latin, which is pretty fun to say. You can say it with me if you want. Nudi, nudum, Christum sequi. That's all right. You don't have to pronounce it right, but in English it means to be a naked follower of a naked Christ. John Wesley wrote that he wanted simplicity, not because material things were bad or having money was evil, or that property in itself was what led to inequality, so say the thinkers of the Enlightenment. Instead, he wanted to be simple because simplicity was clarity. Simplicity meant getting everything else that wasn't important out of the way so you could focus on what was truly important, which is to love God with all your heart and soul, strength and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. St. Francis of Assisi, who we celebrate today, was not born Francis. He was born Giovanni, though his father, who was an Italian silk merchant, married a French woman named Pica, and he was so in love with the freedom of life that the French proclaimed that he named his son the free man, or Francisco. It could also be the Frenchman, but he's Italian, so that's confusing. When he was a young man, his father, who sold silk, was very wealthy, and so Francis participated in all the vices of the day. Now get ready, this might shock some of you. He went to circuses. I know, big deal back then, but that wasn't looked well upon by the church at that time. He also saw troubadours. I know. We can look past this. Cancel not Francis, okay, for going to his troubadour shows. But he lived free and loose, and he had a lot of money, and he liked to spend it. When he was only 21 years old, he spent a year as a captive of war, and he was able to be released if his father would pay a ransom. And so he wrote a letter to his father saying, "Father, please, I'm being held captive. I'm not being fed. Can you send me money?" And his father, Beradone, said no. Money was important to his family because money was how they got status as merchants. And so he wouldn't spare money even for his own son to be released from captivity. When he got back, Francis was changed. He spent more time in the church. And once while he sat in the pews of a dilapidated chapel, he heard the voice of God in a divine vision that changed him forever. And it said, "Francis, repair my church, which is in ruins." And so Francis, trying to follow after the voice of God, took what he had as his father was out of town, which was several yards of silk and a cow, and he sold them and got coins in silver and brought them to the priest of the chapel and said, "I've received a vision from God to rebuild his church. Here's all the money I could muster." But the priest was no dummy. He knew who Francisco was, and he said, "Aren't you Beradone's son? Is this your money or his?" And Francis admitted that he had stolen from his father to give the money for the church. And so the priest refused the money, and it stayed on the floor, and Francis fled and hid in a cave for an entire month by himself. When he finally got to the point of so much poverty that he couldn't be an outlaw anymore, he came back and threw himself at the mercy of his father, who beat him and imprisoned him in a wine cellar in their house until he could be seen by the Bishop of Assisi. Oh, that dog just ate it. Are they okay? Okay, we're good. Back then, they didn't have courts like we did. Instead, you would stand before the bishop and make your case, and your accusers would make their case, and then the bishop would decide. And so Francis sat before the bishop and admitted what he had done, and he said, "Please, let me, Father, to be forgiven of my sins. Let me just enter the priesthood." And the father said, no, you stole what was mine. You stole what was mine, and you're going to pay for it. And so, in a moment of poetic simplicity, Francis stood and said, Father, what is mine is now yours. And the last possession after his long imprisonment that he owned was his own cloak. And so he stripped naked in front of everyone in the town square and was then adopted by the priest to whom he had tried to sell his father's possessions to build the church. And eventually he became a priest and then the founding brother of the Order of St. Francis, which maintains his memory to this day. Simplicity is not saying that things of the world are bad. It is not a minimalism stripped of spirituality or tradition. Simplicity is saying, I'm going to put my priorities straight, and I'm going to recognize that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, from the birds and the beasts and even of ourselves. Francis's love of animals was not rooted in a pity for the lower station of beings. It was a spiritual intuition that the animals are loved by God, and that when they were made, they too were called good. Like Francis, we too can be naked followers of a naked Christ who hung naked upon the cross, was humiliated, and pushed to the side. And it is through that humility that we call Christ King. May it be so for you, as the example of St. Francis laid out and the example of Jesus laid out. Amen.